particularly well placed to focus in developing a policy on human rights defenders. The Commonwealth basically can't sit back and rely on existing mechanisms to do the work they're supposed to be doing in protecting human rights defenders. So take, for example, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. She has a very small staff based in Geneva. She has very, very limited resources. It's simply not possible for her to travel to all the countries to comprehensively monitor the situation of human rights defenders and to enforce the recommendations that she makes in particular cases. And that's actually reflected in a very basic lack of compliance by governments with the UN Special Rapporteur's recommendations, even with the actual process that the UN Special Rapporteur has in place. So, for example, in 2008, the Special Rapporteur wrote letters of allegation or complaint to 12 Commonwealth countries. India was actually the most cited. It received 17 letters. Sri Lanka received 10. Both countries responded to only 4 of those letters. And of course, that response was probably in many cases fairly basic, and simply the response itself does not determine that the government is actually going to act on what it says it's going to do. The only country to respond to all the letters it received was the Bahamas, and the Bahamas only received 1 letter. So there is scope in this case for the Commonwealth maybe to get more involved in working with governments to develop ways in which levels of compliance could be improved. There are gaps there. There's also scope for the Commonwealth to raise awareness. This is something Hassan was mentioning, to raise awareness amongst individual human rights defenders on the ground about the work of the UN Special Rapporteur. If you look at the complaints that the Special Rapporteur receives from Commonwealth countries, they are regionally biased. There's very few from the Pacific Islands, very few from the Caribbean. This might be due to any number of reasons, but one may well be a lack of awareness in these areas about the work of the Special Rapporteur, or feeling of distance amongst human rights defenders in these areas about UN mechanisms, not really feeling that they're relevant or can do very much. So there could be scope there for the Commonwealth in developing its policy to think about education and awareness raising on the ground. Another area, national human rights institutions. These are key bodies. They're set up by governments, but they're supposed to be independent bodies implementing the international human rights standards on the ground. They have a potentially key role to play in the protection of human rights defenders, and human rights defenders are also potentially key allies in the work of national human rights institutions. Yet, in many cases, human rights defenders are excluded from the process by governments of setting up national human rights institutions. And once the national human rights institutions are set up, they then exclude human rights defenders from the development of the strategy of the national human rights institution. So, for example, in India, which has a core group of NGOs, which is supposed to meet with the National Human Rights Commission to work together on the way forwards in implementing human rights standards. That group was reconstituted in 2006, and since then it's met only 5 times, which really does not indicate a great commitment on the part of the National Human Rights Commission to genuinely involving NGOs in its work. In addition, national human rights institutions often don't take the violations suffered by human rights defenders as seriously as they ought to. In Sri Lanka, which is a country in which human rights defenders have suffered egregious abuses, from death, imprisonment, slander, the National Human Rights Commission has spoken out in only 1 case. In 2008, I think, when a grenade was thrown at the house of a prominent human rights activist. And even in that case, it failed to make any recommendations, and it failed to pin blame on any state authorities. In the Maldives, the Maldivian Detainee Network has tried to encourage the National Human Rights Commission to create a specific human rights defender cell so that human rights defenders can easily access the commission. But the National Human Rights Commission in the Maldives has failed to do so, and has actually said that it really doesn't see the need for such a cell. which sort of indicates that these commissions are not really taking seriously the really potentially very important role that they could play in the protection of human rights defenders. Now, the Commonwealth has worked to set up national human rights institutions in many Commonwealth countries, and it's developed a set of best practice guidelines for national human rights commissions. So there's great potential here for the Commonwealth to work with national human rights institutions, both in the process of setting them up and with those that are already created, to encourage them to raise awareness of their potential important role in protecting human rights defenders, and to encourage them to have a specific policy on human rights defenders. And this would go, I think, a great way towards just giving human rights defenders a body in the country that they can approach, that they know they can approach, and they know that work can be done. And it's also a potential liaison point between the national level and the UN Special Rapporteur. Given her limited lack of resources, the national human rights institutions can play a really great role in bringing cases to her attention and conversely working to implement her recommendations on the ground. So this is actually, I think, one area in which the Commonwealth could actually really make a difference and really should think about working more closely with national human rights institutions in this respect. A third way the Commonwealth could get involved would be to assist governments in creating national action plans on human rights. These are roadmaps for the way in which a country plans to implement human rights standards. And the Commonwealth has already developed a model national action plan on human rights, which at present does include a statement urging governments to include in their national action plans measures to create an enabling environment for human rights defenders, most particularly the creation of a legal regime that balances the legitimate interest of the state on regulating some of the activities of an organization with the freedom of these organizations to carry out their work lawfully. At present, however, only a handful of Commonwealth countries have a national action plan, and in fact, very, very few of them, if any, mention human rights defenders. So again, given that the Commonwealth has already done work in this area, it's another potential place in which it could, in developing a policy, it could set out ways in which it will work more closely with governments to assist them to develop these national action plans and to ensure the inclusion of human rights defenders and the need for human rights defenders to be given space within those action plans. So these pull factors demonstrate, I think, that there is considerable space for the Commonwealth to develop and act on a policy on human rights defenders, working with existing mechanisms and frameworks to improve the capacity of those mechanisms and frameworks at all levels. And crucially, the very act of developing such a policy would give greater legitimacy to the work of human rights defenders. We've already heard from Mandeep that often they fall foul of government policies on national security, which is ironic given the natural alliance that should exist in this area between human rights defenders and governments. So the very development of the policy would actually send a clear signal that the Commonwealth recognises the significance of the work of human rights defenders and that their protection is something urgent and necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. I think that the categories that you have identified for us of opportunity are really critical because when you go to certainly our experiences, that the more that you can say to institutions, but you already have this. You don't need to create anything more. You can come in here cheaply. Is the more acceptable the action plan is. So just a brief summary reminder before we head into the discussion. Mandeep spoke to us about legal and policy threats that have evolved recently to human rights. Not recently, but become worse recently. And how we could recommended strengthening the human rights mechanisms of the Secretariat. Hassan described the problems which range from intimidation, lack of acceptance, lack of charity status, all the way up to death, which face all those who stand up for the vulnerable.